Poor student defends, classmate from bully, shocked to discover he stood up for the president's son. That's what they would say later, in the headlines that would change everything. But on that gray Tuesday in November, Eli Foster was just trying to survive another day at Westridge Academy with holes in his shoes and $3 in his pocket. The rain fell in angry sheets across the sprawling campus, the kind of bone-chilling downpour that seemed to target those least equipped to handle it. Eli hunched his shoulders against the cold, his threadbare jacket offering minimal protection as he navigated puddles on his way to the dining hall. The soggy cardboard beneath his right heel was finally giving way, allowing icy water to seep into his sock with each step. He'd been at Westridge Academy for exactly 73 days. Not that he was counting. The scholarship that had delivered him from his crumbling public school to this pristine institution of marble floors and mahogany paneling covered tuition and books, but little else. The contrast between his life and that of his classmates stretched wider than the Grand Canyon, evident in everything from their casual mentions of summer homes to the dismissive glances at his patched uniform. Eli kept his head down as he entered the dining hall, the warm air hitting his face like a gentle slap. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach as conversations hushed momentarily, then resumed with practiced indifference. He had learned to navigate these waters with painful precision, taking food quickly, finding an inconspicuous corner, making himself invisible. "Hey, scholarship boy," came the voice Eli had grown to dread. Blake Harrington, third-generation Westridge legacy and self-appointed social gatekeeper, blocked his path with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. "I see you're modeling the latest in homeless fashion again." Laughter rippled from Blake's ever-present entourage. Eli felt heat creep up his neck, but kept his eyes on the scuffed floor tiles. "Nothing to say? Maybe your brain is as empty as your wallet." The familiar script played out as it had dozens of times before. Eli calculated his options: engage and become a target, or retreat and preserve what little dignity remained. He chose silence, attempting to sidestep the obstacle in his path. Blake wasn't finished. "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm talking to you." A hand shot out, shoving Eli's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. Somewhere in the distance, a cafeteria worker looked over, then deliberately away. The unspoken rules of Westridge were clear. Social hierarchies were to be respected, even by staff. Especially by staff. Eli clutched his tray tighter, knuckles whitening. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Keep your head down. This is your ticket out. Don't mess it up." The scholarship was everything. His future, his family's hope, his escape from the cycle of poverty that had claimed his parents. One wrong move could send him back to a life of limited possibilities. "I just want to eat lunch," Eli muttered, hating the quiver in his voice. "What was that?" "I don't speak poverty." Blake's smile widened as his audience chuckled on cue. Eli took a deep breath and tried again to move past, but Blake shifted, intentionally bumping him. The tray tilted. A glass of water toppled, sending a cold splash across Eli's already damp uniform. Perfect. Just perfect. With resignation, Eli set his tray down to salvage what he could. As he reached for napkins, he caught a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. Another student entering the cafeteria. The newcomer walked with his head down, shoulders hunched in a posture Eli recognized intimately. The universal body language of someone trying not to be noticed. Even from a distance, something about this student seemed different. His uniform was perfectly tailored, but he wore it uncomfortably, as if the fabric itself was foreign to him. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that partially obscured his face, and he moved with a hesitance that seemed out of place in the confident corridors of Westridge. Blake noticed him too. Like a predator sensing vulnerability, he immediately lost interest in Eli and pivoted toward the new target. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with his presence," Blake called out, loud enough to turn heads throughout the dining hall. "It's the mystery man himself." The newcomer froze, eyes darting toward the nearest exit. Eli recognized that look too. The rapid calculation of escape routes, the weighing of humiliation against hunger. What's wrong? Too good to eat with the rest of us?" Blake advanced, his entourage fanning out behind him. 2 weeks at Westridge, and you still haven't figured out how things work here?" The newcomer, Eli vaguely remembered him being introduced as Daniel or David something, took a step back. "I'm just getting lunch," he said quietly. "He speaks," Blake exclaimed with mock surprise. "I was beginning to think they'd sent us a mute. Or maybe you're just antisocial. What's your deal anyway?" Too important to make friends? Eli watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of déjà vu, except now he was the spectator rather than the target. The relief of temporary reprieve mixed uncomfortably with something else. Recognition, empathy, and a flicker of something that felt dangerously like courage. Blake reached out and knocked the tray from the new student's hands. The clatter of plastic against tile echoed through the suddenly silent room. "Oops," Blake said with exaggerated innocence. "Guess you'll have to try again." The new student stared at his spilled lunch, face flushing red. Something in his expression, not fear or anger, but a profound resignation, struck Eli like a physical blow. It was the look of someone who had expected better, who still believed, despite everything, that people should be kind to one another. Before he could think better of it, Eli stepped forward. "Leave him alone, Blake." The words hung in the air, unexpected and irretrievable. Eli felt as though he'd stepped off a cliff, the ground no longer beneath his feet. Blake turned slowly, eyebrows raised in amused disbelief. "Excuse me, did the charity case just try to give me an order?" Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, blood rushing in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to back down, apologize, retreat, but his eyes met those of the new student, wide with surprise and something that might have been gratitude, and he found he couldn't move. "He's not bothering anyone," Eli continued, his voice steadier than he felt. "Just let him get his lunch." The dining hall had gone completely silent now, the audience entranced by this unexpected plot twist. Blake's face darkened as he realized his authority was being challenged in front of witnesses. "You're defending him?" Blake took a step closer, using his height advantage to loom over Eli. "You don't even know him." "I know a bully when I see one," Eli replied, the words coming from some reserve of courage he hadn't known he possessed. Blake's eyes narrowed. "You must be eager to lose that scholarship, because that's what's going to happen when you can't show up for class after I'm done with you." The threat hung in the air, explicit and believable. Eli swallowed hard. He'd promised his mother he wouldn't fight, wouldn't give the administration any reason to send him back. One incident report could be enough to revoke his scholarship, his future condensed to this moment, balanced on the edge of a knife. But before Blake could make good on his threat, the new student stepped forward. "Enough." Just one word, but spoken with such unexpected authority that everyone, including Blake, turned to look. The new student straightened his shoulders, and something in his demeanor shifted so dramatically that Eli almost didn't recognize him as the same person. "Your name is Blake Harrington, correct?" The new student's voice had transformed, crisp and formal. "Your father is Richard Harrington of Harrington Financial Group?" Blake's confidence faltered slightly. "Yes, so what if he is? I believe your father has several government contracts pending review." The new student brushed his dark hair away from his face, revealing features that suddenly seemed strikingly familiar to Eli. "I wonder how he would feel about his son's behavior being brought to the attention of the ethics committee overseeing those contracts." The blood drained from Blake's face so quickly that Eli thought he might pass out. You're Daniel Chambers," the student supplied, extending his hand with sudden poise. "Though the press usually refers to me as Daniel Chambers Montgomery. My father is rather particular about the family name being used properly in official settings." Eli felt the world tilt beneath his feet as recognition dawned. Daniel Chambers Montgomery, the president's son. The president's son who had mysteriously disappeared from public view several weeks ago, around the same time a new transfer student had quietly joined Westridge Academy. The president's son who Eli had just defended from a bully, without having the slightest idea who he was. Blake took an instinctive step backward, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, fear, and calculation. "I didn't... we were just... It was a joke." "Interesting," Daniel replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "I've never found harassment particularly amusing." He turned to Eli, a small smile softening his features. "Thank you for stepping in." Not many would have. Eli couldn't find words. The adrenaline that had propelled him forward drained away, leaving him lightheaded and vaguely nauseated. He had just risked his scholarship, his future, everything that mattered, for the president's son, who clearly needed no protection at all. Daniel seemed to read his thoughts. "Actually," he said loud enough for the entire dining hall to hear, "I was hoping to find someone to show me around the campus." The official tour was somewhat lacking. His eyes met Eli's with surprising warmth. "Would you have time after lunch? I'd be grateful for the company." It was a lifeline, thrown with deliberate precision. A public endorsement that transformed Eli's act of foolhardy courage into a social coup. Blake and his friends retreated, muttering excuses, while the rest of the room buzzed with this new development. Sure, Eli managed, still trying to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. Daniel bent down to retrieve his fallen tray, a surprisingly humble gesture from someone who probably had staff to pick up after him at home. Great. I'll get a new lunch and meet you by the east entrance in 20 minutes. Eli nodded, unable to form a coherent response. As Daniel walked away, the dining hall erupted into whispers and surreptitious glances. Eli stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had defended the president's son, and somehow, impossibly, it seemed he had just made a friend. The rain had softened to a gentle mist by the time Eli met Daniel at the east entrance. He'd spent the intervening 20 minutes in a bathroom stall, alternately hyperventilating and trying to dry his damp uniform under the hand dryer. His mind raced with questions and concerns. Was this some elaborate prank? Would Secret Service agents materialize and interrogate him? Was his scholarship now at even greater risk? But when Daniel appeared, alone and without fanfare, some of Eli's anxiety ebbed. Up close, without the distortion of adrenaline and shock, the president's son looked remarkably normal, tired even. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and there was a tension in his shoulders that belied his confident demeanor from the dining hall. "Thanks for coming," Daniel said, offering a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. "And thanks again for earlier. You didn't have to do that." Eli shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "I didn't know who you were. That's exactly why I'm thanking you," Daniel replied. "You stepped in because it was the right thing to do, not because of who my father is." They began walking, an awkward silence stretching between them, Eli gesturing half-heartedly at buildings as they passed. "That's the Science Center. Library's over there." Daniel nodded politely, but Eli could tell he wasn't really listening. After several minutes of this charade, Daniel stopped abruptly beneath the sprawling oak that marked the center of campus. "Look, I'm not actually interested in a tour," he admitted. "I've had the official version 3 times already, complete with the school's illustrious history and famous alumni." He ran a hand through his hair, a surprisingly ordinary gesture. "I just wanted to talk to you without an audience." Eli shifted uncomfortably. "About what happened in the cafeteria? I'm sorry if I interfered." "No," Daniel interrupted. "Don't apologize. I'm trying to thank you properly." He sighed, looking suddenly younger and more vulnerable. "Do you know how rare it is for someone to stand up for me without an agenda? Without knowing or caring who my father is?" Eli didn't know how to respond to that. The concept of people having agendas in their interactions was foreign to his experience. Survival had always been agenda enough. "Can we start over?" Daniel extended his hand. "I'm Daniel. Just Daniel. Not the president's son or anything else. Just a new student who's sick of having his entire identity defined by his father." Something in his voice, a rawness, a plea for genuine connection, resonated with Eli. He took the offered hand. "I'm Eli. Scholarship student, obviously. Not exactly fitting in here." Daniel's smile returned, more relaxed this time. "Yeah, I noticed. We have that in common, at least. You're comparing being the president's son to being on financial aid." Eli couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Different kinds of not fitting in, same result." Daniel shrugged. "You get treated differently because you don't have money. I get treated differently because of who my father is. Either way, nobody sees the actual person." Eli considered this perspective, finding an unexpected truth in it. "I guess I never thought about it that way." They resumed walking, this time without the pretense of a tour. Daniel explained how he'd convinced his father to let him attend a regular school, or as regular as a prestigious academy like Westridge could be, under a modicum of privacy. The Secret Service detail was present but discreet, the staff aware but sworn to secrecy, the goal being some semblance of normalcy after years in the suffocating bubble of presidential protection. "I just wanted to know what it's like," Daniel said quietly, "to be a normal teenager, to make friends who like me for me, not because my father is the most powerful man in the country." "And how's that working out for you?" Eli asked, gesturing back toward the dining hall. Daniel laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Not great, obviously. Turns out I don't actually know how to make friends. The social skills required weren't covered in my briefings on diplomatic protocol." The self-deprecating humor caught Eli off guard. He found himself smiling, then chuckling, then outright laughing alongside Daniel. It felt strange. Laughter wasn't something he'd experienced much of lately, focused as he was on academics and survival. "So that's why you've been keeping to yourself?" Eli asked as their laughter subsided. I noticed you don't really talk to anyone. Partly that, Daniel admitted, and partly because I'm terrified of saying the wrong thing and ending up as a viral meme. He grimaced. The last time I tried to have a normal conversation with someone my age, I accidentally mentioned meeting the Queen of England. It didn't go well. Eli couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it. Yeah, I can see how that might be a conversation stopper. What about you? Daniel asked, his tone gentler. Why does Blake target you specifically? The question sobered Eli immediately. He considered deflecting, but found himself answering honestly instead. I'm here on full scholarship. My dad works maintenance at an apartment complex. My mom cleans houses when her health allows. I don't have the right clothes, the right background, the right anything. He kicked at a pebble on the path. People like Blake can smell the poverty on me. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That's really messed up. I'm sorry. It's fine. Eli shrugged, the automatic response of someone who had learned early that complaining changed nothing. It's not fine. Daniel insisted, stopping to face him directly. And you know what? Blake shouldn't get away with treating anyone like that. There was something in his tone, a hint of the authority he displayed in the dining hall, that made Eli nervous. Look, I appreciate the thought, but please don't make a big deal about this. My scholarship depends on me keeping a low profile. One complaint from a student like Blake, whose family probably donated a wing of this school, and I'm gone. Daniel's expression darkened. That's not right. That's life, Eli countered. Not all of us have the luxury of fighting every injustice we encounter. As soon as the words left his mouth, Eli regretted them. They sounded bitter, ungrateful, especially directed at someone who had just offered him friendship. But instead of taking offense, Daniel nodded slowly. Fair point. I have privileges you don't. He thought for a moment, but maybe that means I should be using those privileges to help, not just acknowledging they exist. Before Eli could respond, a discreet cough interrupted them. A man in a nondescript suit stood a respectful distance away, his earpiece the only indication of his role. Mr. Montgomery, you have class in 5 minutes. Daniel sighed. Thanks, Agent Pearson. He turned back to Eli. I have to go, but can we talk again? Maybe after school tomorrow? The request was so earnest, so devoid of pretense, that Eli found himself nodding despite his reservations. Sure. I usually study in the library until 6. Perfect. I'll find you. Daniel smiled again, that transformative expression that made him seem like any other teenager. And Eli? Thanks again for seeing me as just Daniel. As Eli watched him walk away, flanked by the now visible security detail, he wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. Defending a classmate from a bully was one thing. Befriending the president's son was something else entirely. Yet beneath the anxiety bubbled an unfamiliar sensation, a warmth, a lightness, that he eventually recognized as hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had found someone at Westridge who understood what it meant to be an outsider. The next few weeks unfolded in a way Eli could never have anticipated. His single act of courage in the dining hall had ripple effects that transformed his Westridge experience entirely. The most immediate change was Blake Harrington's abrupt shift in behavior. The bully now avoided Eli completely, going so far as to change direction in hallways rather than risk an encounter. The whispered explanation making its way through student gossip channels was that Blake's father had received a very specific phone call from a very important person, resulting in a lecture that had left Blake pale and subdued for days. Eli confronted Daniel about this during one of their now regular study sessions in the library. Did you say something to get Blake in trouble? He asked, closing his calculus textbook with more force than necessary, because he looks at me like I'm radioactive now. Daniel didn't look up from his history notes. I might have mentioned the situation to my father during our weekly call. Daniel, and he might have mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Blake's father. Now he did look up, expression unrepentant. I didn't ask him to do anything specific. I just told him what happened. Eli ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I told you I didn't want you to make a big deal about it. And I decided that was a stupid request. Daniel replied calmly. Nobody should be allowed to terrorize other students just because their family has money. That's not how the real world works. Maybe it should be. Daniel's expression softened. Look, I didn't get Blake expelled or anything. I just made sure there were consequences for his actions. Isn't that what you do when someone breaks rules? Apply consequences. Eli wanted to be angry but found he couldn't summon the emotion. The truth was, moving through Westridge without Blake's constant harassment had been liberating. He'd even answered a question in English class yesterday, something he would never have risked before, afraid of drawing attention to himself. Fine, he conceded, but no more presidential interventions without telling me first, okay? Daniel grinned. Did he deal? Although technically it wasn't presidential, just paternal. This was the other change that had come into Eli's life. Friendship. Real friendship, with inside jokes and comfortable silences and heated debates about everything from environmental policy to whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Daniel was horrifyingly pro-pineapple. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, or perhaps because of them, they found in each other perspectives they'd never considered. For Daniel, Eli provided a window into ordinary life. The struggles, the resilience, the simple joys untainted by political calculation. For Eli, Daniel offered something equally valuable: the confidence to take up space in a world that had always told him to make himself smaller. The friendship wasn't without its complications. Secret Service agents were a constant, if discreet, presence. There were days when Daniel couldn't meet because of family obligations that involved secure calls or briefings. And there was the unavoidable reality that their lives operated on different planes, made clear one afternoon when Daniel casually mentioned canceling weekend plans because his father needed to fly to Geneva for emergency talks. But these differences became less important as weeks passed and their bond deepened. They developed routines, studying together in the library, sharing lunch at a corner table, weekend walks around the campus perimeter where Daniel's security detail could maintain their protective bubble without hovering directly overhead. It was during one such walk, with November giving way to December and the first dusting of snow coating the grounds, that Eli finally asked the question that had been lingering at the back of his mind. Why did you transfer to Westridge in the middle of the semester? The official story about your father wanting you to experience a traditional education doesn't explain the timing. Daniel was quiet for so long that Eli thought he might not answer. They had reached the old stone wall that marked the eastern boundary of campus, and Daniel ran his gloved fingers along the rough surface, brushing away snow. There was an incident, he finally said, voice carefully neutral. At my last school. Eli waited, sensing there was more to the story. I had what I thought was a close friend there. Thomas. We'd known each other since we were kids, before my dad was even in politics. Daniel's expression darkened. Turns out he was recording our conversations, selling information about me and my family to tabloids. That's awful, Eli said, genuine shock in his voice. What kind of person does that? The kind who sees a relationship with the president's son as a business opportunity. The bitterness in Daniel's voice was palpable. The last straw was when he tried to get me to talk about a sensitive diplomatic situation while recording. If that information had leaked, he shook his head, it could have compromised actual national security, not just my privacy. Eli tried to imagine such a betrayal and couldn't. His life had never involved secrets worth selling. Is that why you were so hesitant to talk to anyone here? Why you kept to yourself? Daniel nodded. The Secret Service vetted Westridge thoroughly, but they can't vet teenagers' intentions. My father wanted to assign me a constant companion, an agent posing as a student, but I refused. I wanted at least the chance of normal interactions. A faint smile touched his lips. Then you stood up for me in the dining hall, and I thought maybe there was one person here worth trusting. The weight of that trust settled over Eli like a mantle. He thought about his own initial reaction, the shock of discovering Daniel's identity, the fleeting calculations about how this connection might benefit him. He dismissed those thoughts immediately, but they had existed, however briefly. I'm not sure I deserve that trust, he admitted. When I found out who you were, I did think about how it might help me. Just for a second, but you didn't act on it. Daniel pointed out. You didn't ask for favors or try to use me as social currency. You just treated me like a person. He kicked at a drift of snow. Do you know how rare that is in my life? Eli didn't know how to respond to that. The sadness underlying Daniel's words, the isolation inherent in his position, made Eli's own struggles seem somehow more manageable. At least he could trust that people saw him for who he really was, even if they judged him for it. Well, he finally said, as your officially unimpressed friend, I feel obligated to remind you that you still owe me $5 from our last coffee run. Daniel's laugh cut through the cold air, bright and genuine. See? That's exactly what I mean. Thomas would never have asked for his money back. Yeah, well, some of us can't afford to subsidize the coffee habits of trust fund kids, even if their dad does have nuclear codes. They continued their walk, conversation shifting to lighter topics. The upcoming winter formal that neither planned to attend, the merciless calculus test they'd both endured that week, the questionable mystery meat served in Tuesday's shepherd's pie. Normal teenage concerns, discussed without the weight of status or circumstance. But as they completed their circuit and headed back toward the dormitories, Eli found himself reflecting on what Daniel had shared. The vulnerability of his admission, the courage it took to keep trying to connect despite betrayal. It made Eli's own act of standing up to Blake seem smaller somehow, less significant. "For what it's worth," he said as they reached the point where they would separate, Daniel to his private room in the East Wing, Eli to his shared dormitory on the other side of campus. "I'm glad you decided to trust me, and I promise I won't record anything without your express written consent, notarized in triplicate." Daniel smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "I know you won't. That's why we're friends." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. What are you doing for winter break?" The question caught Eli off guard. His plans were as they always were: return to his family's 2-bedroom apartment, help his father with maintenance jobs when possible, try not to think about the contrast between his life at home and the opulence of Westridge. "Just going home," he said with a shrug. "Nothing special. Would you consider an alternative?" Daniel looked uncharacteristically nervous. "My father has this tradition of hosting a group of my friends at Camp David for a few days after Christmas. It's usually just a formality, kids of his political allies, that sort of thing." He rushed on before Eli could respond. "But this year I told him I wanted to invite an actual friend. Someone I chose, not someone chosen for me." Eli blinked, trying to process what was being suggested. "You want me to come to Camp David? With the president? For Christmas? After Christmas? Just for 3 days?" Daniel's expression was earnest. "You don't have to decide right now. I know it's a lot to consider, but think about it, please." With that, he turned and walked toward his dormitory, leaving Eli standing in the gently falling snow, trying to reconcile the simple act of defending a classmate with the extraordinary turns his life had taken since. Camp David, with the President of the United States. It was absurd, impossible, and yet somehow it was his reality now. As he made his way back to his own dormitory, feet crunching in the fresh snow, Eli thought about how a single moment of courage had altered the trajectory of his life. Not because he defended someone important, but because he defended someone, period. The simple human connection that had formed from that action, the genuine friendship that had grown, was more valuable than any material advantage his association with Daniel might bring. For the first time since arriving at Westridge, Eli felt as though he truly belonged. Not because the school had accepted him, but because he had found someone who saw him clearly and valued what they saw. The snow continued to fall, covering the campus in a pristine blanket that erased distinctions between scholarship students and legacies, between the privileged and the struggling. In that moment, watching his footprints disappear behind him, Eli understood something profound about connection. Sometimes the most important walls we break down are the ones we build ourselves. The invitation to Camp David hung over Eli like a surreal dream in the weeks that followed. He postponed giving Daniel a definitive answer, caught between excitement and anxiety. How would his parents react? What would he wear? How did one behave around the President of the United States? Would the other guests, surely children of diplomats and senators, see him immediately as an imposter? These questions consumed him as final exams approached, competing with calculus formulas and historical dates for space in his overtaxed brain. Daniel, to his credit, didn't press for an answer, though his hopeful glances whenever the subject of winter break arose made his preference clear. It was during their last study session before exams, huddled in their usual corner of the library as snow fell silently outside the tall windows, that Eli finally voiced his deepest concern. "I don't belong in a place like Camp David," he said quietly, closing his textbook. "I wouldn't know how to act or what to say. I'd embarrass myself and embarrass you." Daniel looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "Is that what you've been worried about?" "Eli, it's just a house. A nice house in the woods with security, yes, but still just a house. And my father wears sweaters with holes in them when he's off duty." "Your father is the president," Eli pointed out, as if Daniel might have somehow forgotten this detail. "Yes, and he's also just a guy who loves bad dad jokes and falls asleep watching old movies." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Look, I'm not asking you to attend a state dinner. It's a casual gathering. Hiking, board games, movies. The tradition started when I was younger, so my father could feel like he was giving me a normal childhood experience despite the office. Eli wasn't convinced. What about the other guests? Won't they be all, he gestured vaguely, politically connected? Some, yes, Daniel admitted. But they're just teenagers who happen to have parents in politics. Most of them are more interested in their phones than international relations. He hesitated, then added more quietly, and honestly, that's part of why I want you there. You're the only real friend I've made here. Maybe the only real friend I've had in years. It would mean a lot to have someone I can actually talk to. The vulnerability in Daniel's voice cut through Eli's reservations. He thought about his own holidays, the cramped apartment, the careful budgeting for a modest gift exchange, his father's exhaustion after taking extra shifts to afford Christmas dinner. They were warm memories despite the financial constraints, full of love and laughter. But wasn't that what Daniel was seeking too? Not the material comfort of Camp David, which he took for granted, but the genuine connection of having someone who saw him as more than his father's son. I'd need to talk to my parents, Eli said finally. And I don't have anything appropriate to wear for 3 days at a presidential retreat. Daniel's face lit up. Is that a yes? It's a I'll ask my parents and we'll see. Eli clarified, but he was smiling now too. And you have to promise not to let anyone arrest me if I use the wrong fork at dinner. Not deal. Though I should warn you, my father sometimes eats pizza with a knife and fork, so he's not one to judge. Daniel's relief was palpable. Thank you for considering it. Really? As they returned to their studies, Eli felt a strange mix of emotions. The prospect of visiting Camp David was intimidating, yes, but also exhilarating in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not because of the prestige or the potential connections, but because his friend had invited him into his world, trusted him to see the person behind the position. That night, in a call that lasted nearly an hour, Eli explained the situation to his parents. Their initial shock gave way to cautious excitement, then to practical concerns about logistics and appropriate clothing, and finally to a pride so evident that Eli felt tears pricking at his eyes. You made a friend who sees your worth, his mother said, her voice cracking slightly over the phone line. That's what matters, not where his father lives or works. His father was more direct. Just be yourself, son. That's who he invited, after all. By the time exams concluded and students began departing for winter break, Eli had given Daniel his answer. The look of genuine joy on his friend's face made any lingering reservations fade into insignificance. As Eli packed his modest belongings, preparing to spend Christmas with his family before joining Daniel at Camp David, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the span of a few months. From isolation and intimidation to friendship and invitation. From keeping his head down to standing tall. All because he'd chosen, in one critical moment, to defend someone who needed defending. Without calculation, without expectation of reward, simply because it was right. The poor student who defended a classmate from a bully could never have imagined where that single act of courage would lead. But as he zipped his duffel bag and took one last look at his dormitory room, Eli Foster knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't change a thing about how it had all unfolded. Sometimes the smallest actions reveal the greatest truths about who we are, and sometimes those revelations change everything. Camp David in winter resembled a scene from a holiday card. Pine trees dusted with snow, rustic cabins with smoke curling from stone chimneys, pristine paths winding through the woods. Eli's first glimpse of the presidential retreat through the window of the official vehicle that had collected him from his family's apartment left him momentarily speechless. It's not what you expected, is it? Daniel asked, grinning at Eli's expression as they approached the main lodge. Everyone thinks it's going to be this ultra-modern compound with laser defense systems or something. I was picturing more flags, at least, Eli admitted, taking in the understated elegance of the retreat. It looks almost normal. That's the whole point. It's a place where presidents can pretend they have regular lives for a few days. Daniel lowered his voice conspiratorially. Though I should warn you, there are snipers in the woods. Just as a casual fun fact. Thanks for that completely relaxing information. Eli replied dryly, suddenly very conscious of every movement he made. His anxiety spiked again as they entered the main lodge. Despite Daniel's assurances about the casual nature of the gathering, Eli had stressed for days about his limited wardrobe. His mother had taken him shopping with money saved from her holiday cleaning jobs, insisting he needed at least one nice outfit. The resulting khakis and sweater were the most expensive clothes he'd ever owned. Yet he still felt hopelessly underdressed as he stepped into the warm, wood-paneled interior. But his worries dissipated somewhat as Daniel led him through the lodge, pointing out features with the casual familiarity of someone showing off their childhood home. There were Christmas decorations still up, tasteful garlands and red bows, a large tree with ornaments that Daniel explained had been collected over decades by various first families. The atmosphere was undeniably presidential in its quality, but there was also something genuinely homey about the space. The other guests arrived tomorrow. Daniel explained as he showed Eli to his room, a comfortable space with a view of the surrounding forest. I asked if you could come a day early so I could show you around without an audience. Eli set his duffel bag on the bed, trying not to visibly react to the luxury of the accommodations. I appreciate that. I'm still not entirely convinced I won't accidentally commit some treasonous faux pas during dinner. Well, if you do, you'll be doing it in front of just my father tonight. He had to cancel a meeting in order to be here, which almost never happens. Daniel's expression softened. He wanted to meet you properly. The casual revelation sent a fresh wave of panic through Eli. Tonight? I'm meeting the president tonight? You're meeting my dad tonight, Daniel corrected gently. Who happens to be the president, yes, but who also just wants to thank the person who stood up for his son. He glanced at his watch. We have about 2 hours before dinner. Want to check out the game room? I guarantee destroying me at pool will help with the nerves. Eli doubted anything could fully calm the butterflies now swarming in his stomach, but he nodded anyway. As they walked through the lodge, he tried to absorb the reality of his situation. He, Eli Foster, whose family sometimes struggled to keep the electricity on, was about to have dinner with the President of the United States. Not at a formal function or public event, but in a private setting as his son's friend. The game room did help marginally. It was surprisingly normal. A pool table, a dartboard, a large television with video game consoles. They played 2 games of pool, Eli winning both, despite his shaking hands, and were halfway through a heated match of table tennis when a discreet knock at the door interrupted them. A staff member, Eli couldn't tell if she was household staff or Secret Service, informed them that dinner would be served in 30 minutes. Thanks, Maria, Daniel replied with easy familiarity. We'll be there. As she left, he turned to Eli with an encouraging smile. Ready to get changed for dinner? Eli nodded, though ready was the furthest thing from how he felt. Back in his room, he carefully put on his new clothes, checking his appearance repeatedly in the mirror. The face that looked back at him seemed somehow different from the one he'd known all his life. More confident, perhaps, or simply more aware of his own capacity for growth. When Daniel knocked on his door, Eli took a deep breath and opened it, prepared to face whatever came next. Dinner was served in a smaller dining room, rather than the formal state dining room Eli had glimpsed during their tour. The table was set for 3, the lighting warm, a fire crackling in the stone hearth. It felt intimate rather than intimidating, though Eli's heart still pounded as they entered. And then President Montgomery was there, rising from his seat at the head of the table. In person, he was both exactly as he appeared in media coverage and somehow completely different. The authoritative presence was unmistakable, but there was also a warmth to him that cameras rarely captured, especially as he looked at his son. You must be Eli, the president said, extending his hand. I've heard a great deal about you. Eli shook the offered hand, desperately hoping his palm wasn't sweating. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. President. James, please. At least while we're at dinner. The president gestured for them to sit. This is family time, not official business. As they settled into their seats, Eli caught Daniel's eye across the table. His friend gave him an encouraging nod, and something in that simple gesture helped Eli's tension begin to ease. This wasn't a test or an evaluation. It was simply dinner with his friend's father. The meal progressed with surprising naturalness. The president, James, asked thoughtful questions about Eli's studies, his adjustment to Westridge, his family. There were no policy discussions or political topics, just the conversation of a father interested in his son's friend. Daniel tells me you're at Westridge on scholarship, James remarked as the main course was served. That's impressive. Their academic standards are exceptionally high. Eli's at the top of our calculus class, Daniel interjected proudly, and English. Actually, pretty much everything except chemistry, but that's because Mr. Harlow is a terrible teacher. Daniel, his father admonished, though his eyes crinkled with amusement. It's true. Even Eli can't understand his explanations, and Eli can understand anything. The president turned to Eli with a raised eyebrow. High praise. Is my son exaggerating your academic prowess? Slightly. Eli admitted, finding it easier to speak now that the initial shock had worn off. I work hard because I have to. The scholarship depends on maintaining a certain GPA. That kind of discipline will serve you well. James nodded. What are your plans after Westridge? College, hopefully. I'm applying for scholarships. Eli hesitated, then added, I want to study environmental engineering. Find ways to make sustainable technology more accessible to lower-income communities. The president's expression turned thoughtful. That's a field with tremendous potential for positive impact. We need more young people thinking about sustainability from an accessibility perspective. The conversation continued to flow, touching on everything from Eli's favorite books to the president's surprisingly extensive knowledge of basketball statistics. By dessert, Eli found himself almost forgetting who he was speaking with. Almost, but not quite, especially when a staff member briefly interrupted to deliver what was clearly an important message, causing James to excuse himself for several minutes. When the president returned, he apologized sincerely. The job doesn't respect dinner hours, I'm afraid. One of the less glamorous aspects of the position. Is everything okay? Daniel asked, concern evident in his voice. Nothing that can't wait until morning, his father assured him. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, Eli was about to tell us about the infamous dining hall incident. Eli felt his face warm. Daniel already told you about that. I heard Daniel's version, James clarified. I'd like to hear yours if you don't mind. What made you step in when no one else did? The question was asked casually, but Eli sensed its importance. He considered his answer carefully. Honestly, I wasn't thinking about consequences in that moment, he finally said. I just saw someone being treated unfairly, and I know what that feels like. To be singled out because you're different somehow. He glanced at Daniel. I didn't know who he was. He was just someone who needed someone else to say enough. The president nodded slowly. Moral courage often works that way. It's not calculated or strategic, it's instinctive. He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face in the same way it did Daniel's. Thank you for having that instinct when my son needed it. The genuine gratitude in his voice made Eli uncomfortable, though not in an unpleasant way. Anyone would have done the same, he demurred. No, James said firmly. They wouldn't have. That's precisely what makes it remarkable. He leaned back in his chair, regarding Eli thoughtfully. Daniel hasn't had an easy time making real friends. The position creates complications. Trust becomes a commodity rather than a given. Daniel shifted in his seat. Dad, it's all right, his father assured him. I'm not embarrassing you. I'm thanking your friend. He turned back to Eli. What I'm trying to say, somewhat inelegantly, is that your friendship has meant a great deal to my son, and by extension to me. The sincerity of the moment left Eli speechless. He looked at Daniel, who was studiously examining his dessert plate, a flush spreading across his face. He's a good friend, Eli finally said. The best I've made at Westridge. The evening continued with lighter conversation, and by the time Eli returned to his room later that night, the surreal nature of having dined with the president had been largely overshadowed by the realization that he had, in fact, simply had dinner with his friend's father. A father who, like his own, cared deeply about his son's happiness. The following days at Camp David unfolded with an unexpected ease. The other guests, 8 teenagers in total, most of them indeed children of political figures, arrived as scheduled. Some regarded Eli with curiosity, clearly aware he wasn't part of their usual circle, but Daniel's obvious friendship with him prevented any overt exclusion. They hiked snow-covered trails, had snowball fights that Secret Service pretended not to monitor, though Eli noticed they always kept the president's son in sight, watched movies in the lodge's comfortable theater room, and played board games that became increasingly competitive as the hours passed. Throughout it all, Eli observed the dynamics between Daniel and these other teenagers. The practiced politeness, the careful conversation, the distinct lack of the easy banter Daniel shared with him. He understood now what Daniel had meant about the rarity of genuine connection in his life. On their final evening, after the others had retired to their rooms, Eli and Daniel sat by the fire in a small sitting area, talking quietly about their return to Westridge after the break. Thank you for coming, Daniel said, watching the flames dance in the hearth. It meant a lot. Thanks for inviting me, Eli replied. It wasn't nearly as terrifying as I expected. Daniel laughed softly. Even dinner with the president? Even that? Eli hesitated, then added, your dad is different than I expected. More, human. Most people never see that side of him. Daniel's expression grew serious. The position changes how everyone interacts with you. They see the office, not the person. He looked at Eli directly. That's why what you did that day in the cafeteria matters so much. You didn't see the president's son. You just saw someone who needed help. Eli shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight Daniel placed on what still seemed to him a simple action. I just did what I hoped someone would do for me. But that's just it. Most people wouldn't. Daniel poked at the fire with a brass tool, sending sparks upward. They calculate the cost, the benefit, the risk. They don't act on instinct or principle alone. He set the poker down carefully. My father has a theory about leadership. He says you learn everything you need to know about a person's character by watching what they do when there's nothing to gain and potentially something to lose. The words hung between them, illuminated by firelight. I'm not a leader, Eli said quietly. I'm just trying to get through school without losing my scholarship. Maybe leadership isn't about position. Daniel suggested, maybe it's about the choices you make when no one's looking, or when everyone is, but you do the right thing anyway. As they sat in companionable silence, watching the fire slowly die down to embers, Eli reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The poor scholarship student and the president's son, finding common ground in their different forms of isolation. The simple act of standing up against a bully, expanding into a friendship that crossed boundaries of privilege and circumstance. He thought about his return to Westridge, how things would be different now, not because of his connection to Daniel, though that had certainly changed his social standing, but because of his own evolving understanding of his place in the world. The courage that had sparked in that dining hall moment had grown, nurtured by Daniel's friendship and his own recognition of his capacity to affect change, however small. As they finally rose to head to their rooms, Daniel paused at the doorway. You know, my father was right about one thing. What's that? Eli asked. Moral courage is instinctive. You can't fake it or learn it. You either have it or you don't. Daniel smiled, that genuine expression that transformed his face. I'm glad you have it, and I'm glad I get to be your friend because of it. The simple sincerity of the statement stayed with Eli long after they'd said goodnight, following him into dreams where the boundaries between worlds dissolved, where actions spoke louder than circumstances, and where a single moment of courage could indeed change everything. When they returned to Westridge for the spring semester, rumors about Eli's winter break spread quickly through the student body. Speculation ranged from the relatively accurate, he'd been invited to Camp David as Daniel's guest, to the wildly exaggerated, he was being groomed for a position in the administration. He had saved the president's life in an unreported incident. Eli found the attention both amusing and uncomfortable. He had never sought the spotlight and still preferred the quiet corners of the library to the social hub of the dining hall. But there was also a newfound confidence in his bearing, a certainty that he belonged at Westridge not despite his differences, but because of the perspective they gave him. Blake Harrington and his friends maintained their distance, though Eli occasionally caught Blake watching him with an expression that mingled resentment with something that might have been respect. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, not because Eli had acquired status through his friendship with Daniel, but because he had demonstrated a kind of courage Blake couldn't comprehend, acting without calculation of personal benefit. As weeks passed and winter reluctantly gave way to spring, Eli and Daniel settled into routines that balanced academics with their deepening friendship. They studied together, argued about politics and philosophy, and gradually expanded their social circle to include a few other students who seemed interested in genuine connection rather than proximity to the president's son. One such student was Mei Lin, a quiet girl from their advanced placement English class who approached their study table one afternoon with a question about the assignment and ended up staying for 2 hours of surprisingly animated discussion about Steinbeck's use of symbolism. You should join us more often, Daniel told her as they packed up their books. Eli's interpretation of literature is either brilliant or completely delusional, and I haven't figured out which yet. Says the guy who thought The Old Man and the Sea was a light beach read, Eli retorted, earning a laugh from May. She became a regular addition to their study sessions, bringing a perspective that complemented their own. Like Eli, she was a scholarship student, the daughter of immigrants who ran a small restaurant in the city. Unlike Eli, she navigated Westridge with a quiet determination that had protected her from the worst of the social hierarchy's judgment. I make myself useful, she explained when Eli asked how she'd avoided the treatment he'd experienced. I tutor Blake Harrington in calculus. It's hard to bully someone who's keeping you from failing a required course. Her pragmatism impressed Eli, though Daniel was less convinced of its merits. You shouldn't have to make yourself useful to be treated with basic respect, he argued during one of their debates. May shrugged. Idealism is a luxury some of us can't afford. I do what works. These conversations, Roy, about privilege, responsibility, compromise, and principle, became the cornerstone of their friendship. Through them, Eli found himself developing a clearer sense of his own values and aspirations. He began to see his scholarship not merely as an escape from limited circumstances, but as a platform from which he might eventually effect meaningful change. As spring semester progressed, this evolution manifested in unexpected ways. When the school announced a competition for innovative sustainability projects, Eli hesitated only briefly before submitting a proposal based on ideas he'd been developing since his conversation with the president at Camp David. His concept, a low-cost solar power system designed specifically for urban apartment buildings with limited roof access, drew on his personal experience growing up in a community where environmental initiatives rarely reached. The proposal included not just technical specifications, but implementation strategies that addressed economic barriers to adoption. When the finalists were announced, Eli's name was among them. The recognition brought a new kind of attention, not for his friendship with the president's son, but for his own intellectual contributions. "You never told me you were working on this," Daniel said when Eli shared the news, his expression a mix of surprise and pride. "I wasn't sure it was good enough," Eli admitted. "And I wanted it to be mine, you know. Not something people thought I achieved because of..." He gestured vaguely between them. Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. "Because of me. Or rather, because of my father." "Yeah." Eli felt a twinge of guilt at the admission. "Is that terrible?" "No," Daniel replied firmly. "It's the opposite, actually. It means you understand something most people in my life don't. That achievement only matters if it's earned." He smiled, that genuine expression that still transformed his serious face. "For what it's worth, I think your project is brilliant, and entirely yours." The sustainability competition culminated in a presentation event where finalists showcased their projects to judges, faculty, and fellow students. Eli, who had once avoided drawing attention to himself at all costs, found himself standing before an audience explaining his vision with surprising confidence. As he fielded questions about implementation challenges and scalability, he caught sight of Daniel and May in the audience, their encouraging expressions bolstering his resolve. But he also noticed others watching. Blake Harrington with reluctant interest, faculty members with growing respect, and, surprisingly, his parents, who had taken time off work to attend without telling him. The sight of his father, still in his maintenance uniform, having come directly from work, and his mother, dressed in her best outfit, save for special occasions, brought a lump to Eli's throat. They had always believed in him, had sacrificed enormously for his education, had supported his friendship with Daniel despite their initial concerns about social differences. When the judges announced that his project had won second place, with funding to develop a prototype and present at a national competition, the pride in his parents' faces meant more than the recognition itself. After the ceremony, as congratulations flowed from unexpected sources, Eli found himself standing with Daniel, May, and his parents in a quiet corner of the reception hall. "Your project was amazing," Daniel told him, with May nodding emphatically beside him. "The judges were practically taking notes during your presentation. We are so proud of you." His mother added, her eyes bright with tears. "So proud." His father, never one for many words, simply clasped his shoulder with a calloused hand. "You're going to change things, son. I always knew it." The moment crystallized something for Eli, a realization that had been forming gradually since that day in the dining hall months ago. The act of defending Daniel hadn't just gained him a friend or changed his social standing at Westridge. It had shown him something about himself, a capacity for courage he hadn't recognized, a willingness to stand for principles even at personal risk. That same courage now allowed him to envision solutions to problems others overlooked, to speak up in classes where he had once been silent, to see his background not as a limitation, but as valuable perspective. As the school year drew to a close, bringing with it decisions about summer plans and thoughts of senior year ahead, Eli reflected on the extraordinary transformation his life had undergone. From the isolated scholarship student keeping his head down to survive, he had become someone who looked up and forward, who saw possibilities rather than barriers. On the last day of classes, he and Daniel walked the campus perimeter one final time before separating for the summer. Daniel to official functions and a diplomatic tour with his father, Eli to a prestigious internship with an environmental engineering firm that had expressed interest in his solar project. Hard to believe it's been less than a year since that day in the dining hall, Daniel remarked as they reached the old stone wall where they had first discussed trust and betrayal months ago. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, Eli agreed. Other times it feels like yesterday. Daniel nodded, understanding in his expression. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't spoken up that day? Eli had thought about it. The parallel life where he had kept his head down, let Blake continue his bullying, never discovered who Daniel really was. A life without their friendship, without Camp David, without the confidence to pursue his ideas and speak his mind. I try not to, he admitted. It makes me question too many other moments when I might have made a difference, but chose not to. That's the thing about moral choices, Daniel said thoughtfully. They seem small in the moment, just one person deciding to act or not act, but they ripple outward in ways we can't predict. He smiled slightly. My father has a saying about that too. Your father has a saying about everything. Eli teased, familiar enough now with the president to joke about him. Occupational hazard of politics. Daniel conceded with a laugh. But this one's actually good. He says the measure of our character isn't found in the big decisions everyone sees, but in the small ones no one notices. Eli considered this, thinking about the seemingly small decision that had altered his path so dramatically. I don't know if I'd call standing up to Blake in front of the entire dining hall a small decision no one noticed, but you didn't know it would be significant, Daniel pointed out. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know it would lead to friendship or Camp David or anything else. You just saw someone being treated unfairly and decided not to let it happen. The simplicity of that framing struck Eli. It was true. He hadn't calculated outcomes or benefits. He had simply acted according to a core belief that people should be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. As they completed their circuit and prepared to part ways for the summer, Daniel extended his hand in the formal manner he sometimes adopted when emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Thank you for being my friend, Eli Foster. Eli bypassed the offered hand and pulled Daniel into a brief, firm hug instead. Thank you for being worth defending, he replied, only half joking. They separated with promises to call and text, to reconnect before the new school year began, to maintain the bond that had formed so unexpectedly from a single moment of courage. Walking back to his dormitory to finish packing, Eli reflected on the strange, wonderful journey of the past year. The poor student who defended a classmate from a bully, shocked to discover he stood up for the president's son. The headline that never was, for a story that changed his life completely. Not because of who Daniel was, but because of who Eli himself had proven to be in that critical moment. Someone who recognized that true value isn't determined by status or circumstance, but by the choices we make when confronted with the opportunity to stand for what's right. As he packed away his books and clothes, preparing for a summer that promised new challenges and opportunities, Eli carried with him the most valuable lesson of his Westridge experience, that a single act of courage can reveal the truth of who we are, and in that revelation, everything can change. Not because we defended someone important, but because in choosing to defend anyone at all, we discover the importance of our own voice, our own principles, our own capacity to affect the world around us, one small, brave decision at a time.